So, welcome everyone to QB Power Hour. Today is Thursday, December 1st, 12 p.m. Eastern. And today's episode is Batching and Automation in QuickBooks Desktop Part 1. And now, not 100% sure if we're going to have a second part or a third part, but for the looks of it, because of the amount of topics, we will have maybe a part 2 and a part 3. Because just on the batching side, there's just quite a bit of topics. Now, today's episode is eligible for ACE. So if you're an advanced QuickBooks Pro advisor, you will get an ACE certificate on top of the CPE certificate that we usually give. Now, the agenda for today, we'll talk about QB Power Hour real quick, the CPE process, and the learning objectives for today is to learn how to automate invoice creation through batch processing of invoices. And then there's some side tools that are for automating billable time and expenses, which we'll discuss as well. We'll learn how to use other small batching tools that can be really powerful, like closing active estimates and closing purchase orders and stuff like that. And we'll also discuss the automation of report printing and report scheduling. So about QB Power Hour, we are a webinar series, usually twice a month, Thursdays at 12 p.m. Eastern, every other Thursday. The next episode will be 2 Thursdays from now, top apps of QuickBooks 2016. So we'll be covering some of our favorite apps for 2016. And then we'll resume again on January the 12th. We don't have a topic for January the 12th yet. It'll likely be maybe QuickBooks Online, a year of updates, or maybe we're considering doing some 1099 or payroll type of topics as well. Now, we typically cover about 50% desktop, 50% online. We've been on a streak of all QuickBooks Desktop topics on the past 3 or 4 episodes because these are our ACE Advanced Certified certificate topics, which I built them in all in desktop, and we will have some QuickBooks Online topics coming in early next year. Now, Michelle Long, it's the co-host of QB Power Hour, and she is not here with us today. She's out in training in the Intuit Advisor Tour, so she will not be with us here today, but you can check out her grouped in LinkedIn and her many books in Amazon. My name is Hector Garcia. I'm a CPA and I'm based out of Miami, Florida. Most of the work that I do is QuickBooks training and consulting. There's my email address, hector@garciacpa.com, if you need to reach to me for whatever reason. Now, some of the other events that are going on is if you want to get certified in QuickBooks Online, there's the Intuit 2017 Bootcamp on December 15 and 16. Just go to QuickBooksVcon.com. It's to get basic certification to QuickBooks Online. And then next year, the major conference for QuickBooks Power users will be Scaling New Heights in Orlando in June. And then the Intuit QuickBooks Conference in San Jose, California, scheduled for November of 2017. Now, we've changed the CPE process. If you were not here on the last episode, we changed the CPE process a little bit. Before, we used to have a password and then a password question. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do polling questions, which you have to answer. There's no right or wrong answer, but you have to answer at least 3 out of the 4 that we will ask in order for you to qualify for the CPE. Now, you also have to attend live and be here for at least 50 minutes to get that. The CPE certificates are emailed to you automatically within 2 or 3 weeks. And again, you will get a CPE certificate and an ACE certificate if you happen to be an advanced certified QuickBooks Pro advisor and you need that. Now, we're going to start with this. This is all about batching and automation. And I did some research about some of the options that we had with batching and automation, and we came up with a lot of possible topics that we can cover today. Anyway, so for batching tools, I came up with, after doing some heavy research, I came up with what is the total amount of tools available in QuickBooks Desktop that we could possibly cover in a topic like batching and automation. And we came up with all these topics, and there's definitely not enough time to cover all of them. But let me just go through them real quick, because for some people, you don't even know that these are available in QuickBooks. So there's a tool called Batch Invoices, which we'll cover in depth. There's a tool that allows you to create multiple invoices in batches from billable time and expenses. We'll likely not cover that, maybe in a second episode of this. There's the option to batch email and batch print forms if they're marked to do so. There's the option to batch print or email from the income tracker, which we'll cover. The option to batch marking the estimates inactive from the income tracker, which we'll cover as well. There's the option to batch edit lists using the add edit multiple list entry. We'll cover that on another episode. There's an option to do change other names into vendors into batch. There's batching of mail merge letters, batching of creating new bank accounts, exclusively just bank accounts in QuickBooks. There's an option to assess finance charges in batches, create statements in batch. So only the ones that you see in red are the ones that we're going to cover today. Now, on the second page here, there's much more. These are more related to sort of inventory and items. There's an option to automatically create POs for all open items that you need to restock. There's an option to batch change all of the inventory assemblies where a particular component is being replaced with another. There's an option to batch print packing lists or pick lists for sales orders that you're about to fulfill. There's an option to close POs in batch, set reorder points in batch, and change prices in batch. And again, that will be covered likely in a different episode. Now, for accountants, there's batch enter, there's batch reclassify, there's batch write-off, batch delete and void, which we'll cover briefly on this episode, process multiple reports in batches. And then there's a few which I call the tricks of the trade, which are not obvious things that QuickBooks does, but with a little bit of finagling of exporting and importing, you can do other things in batch, like changing list name information, account numbers, adjusting negative quantity on hand in a batch format, converting multiple customers to jobs and vice versa, and changing pre-fill accounts through Excel and batch enter transactions. And in terms of automation, there is a limit though of the things that you can do with automation. There's scheduled reports, which we'll cover, and then there's memorized transactions, which we'll cover. And again, this is all 100% QuickBooks Desktop, not QuickBooks Online. So we're going to jump into QuickBooks Desktop real quick, but let me first cover a couple of really important rules about batching invoices. So batching invoices is not the same thing as memorizing an invoice and creating them automatically. It's a specific function that creates multiple invoices in a single click to multiple customers, all with the same item or sales price. That's a really important thing. A lot of people don't use it. And this is also in lieu of taking a current invoice and duplicating it 2 or 3 times. So if you got 2 or 3 customers that you have to invoice the exact same thing, I would strongly recommend that you duplicate the invoice 2 or 3 times instead of using a batch invoicing tool, which we're about to cover. Now, batch invoicing tool uses a concept called billing groups, which is basically a group of customers that all get billed or invoiced the exact same thing. Now, what are some use cases for batch invoicing? Well, we have companies that do property management that charge a flat dollar amount to a whole group of apartments or something like that. Or we have landscaping companies, or we have anyone that's in the business of having multiple clients that they charge the same thing or about the same thing every month. That would be a good candidate for that. Okay. Now, this will not work if the invoice template has required header fields. So if you create a custom field that you have to fill in a template, it will stop the batching from working. If you never worked with custom fields, then you really don't have to worry about that, but that's just an important point to make. And also, any custom header fields that you need to enter data for in a batch invoice, you cannot do it. So you have to enter data after completion, right? So that's a couple of really important things about batch invoicing. So here on the customers menu, there's a button here that says create batch invoices. So I'm going to go ahead and click on create batch invoices. And this is going to tell me, hey, by the way, you have to make sure that the terms, sales tax, or what type of sales tax the customer gets based on the county they're in or city or whatever, and the send method. This is whether or not you want to batch print or batch email the invoices, right? Because QuickBooks can create them in batch, but batch creating them doesn't necessarily send them. You have to press one more button to email them or to print them. So it's really, really important that you set up those preferences right off the bat. Now, let me just show you real quick what that is. So let me close that for a second. If you go into customers, customer center, and you go to any individual customer, so I'm just going to double click on any individual customer here. Individual customers are going to have their address, of course, and then under sales tax setting, you have to put, if you had sales tax enabled, you have to make sure that their sales tax item that belongs to that customer is correct, because otherwise you can batch create an invoice with a wrong sales tax item if that's not set up correctly. Also, the payment terms, it's going to grab it from the default payment terms of that customer. So again, the due date of that invoice may be wrong if you don't have those payment terms preset right off the bat. And also the preferred delivery method, email or print, is really, really important, because when you batch create invoices, you also have to get them to the customer, and you're either going to print them all or you're going to email them all. So it's extremely important that you have preset in every single customer that's getting a batch, preset mail if you're going to print the invoices in batch, or preset email if you're planning to email them in batch. So extremely, extremely important to keep that in mind as a setup, as a premise to doing the batch invoicing. Now, let's go ahead and go into customers and batch invoicing, create batch invoicing, and look at this function. So in here, you're going to see a couple of things. So on the left side of the screen, you're going to see your entire active customer list. So if your customer is inactive, it will not show up in here. Now, on the left side of the screen, I can actually manually select the customers that apply or that would get a massive invoice that we're going to create in batch. So after we select all the customers, and we can select the customers, the jobs, whatever it happens to be, then we're going to click on the add button. So right here on the add button, and that's going to bring them into one group of customers. Now, that group of customers, you may want to, before adding them, so I'm going to click on remove, you may want to create a billing group first. So up here on the right, it says billing group. So you may want to create a billing group, and then we're going to call this monthly $75 service or something like that. Because let's say, for example, that this group of customers is going to get a monthly service of $75. So I'll create the group and I'll call it monthly $75 service. That way I know that whoever I end up adding from my list, right? So I'll pick, whatever the customers are, whoever I add from my list and click on add goes into that group. That means that when I press one button, every single person is going to get that same invoice. Now, some of the important tools here on the right side where it says look for, you could search within any of the fields. So if you want to, for example, bill everybody within a specific state or a specific zip code or a specific city, assuming that, and I'm going to go ahead and remove these, assuming that you do have multiple in common, I can just search there, look for California, for example, and then click on search. And this will now narrow down only my customers that are in California or that have, CA on the state portion. And then I can just click on select all and then click on add. So there's a couple of tools in this screen to kind of group the customers in any logical way. Now, if you select in and you click on all fields and you have your customers set up as customer type and you want to group them by customer type, this can also search within customer type. So if you're using customer type, you can use customer type as a way to group them as well, to then make it easier to create these billing groups. Okay, so we added all the customers that we want to charge the $75 a month for, and we're going to go ahead and click on Save Group, and that basically saves the entire list into this group called Monthly $75 Service. I could actually create an entirely different group, and let's call it Monthly 125 or something like that. And let's say that that's going to be an entirely different group altogether. That's going to be, let's say, this customer and that customer, and I can save this group, and then I would have basically two groups. I would have my $75 group, and then I have my $125 group. And when I create my batch, I have to do all the ones that get the exact same item and the exact same amount in there. Okay. So I'm gonna pick whatever group I want to do the batch invoicing for. I'll pick up here where it says billing group, and put $75, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit next. Now, this screen is basically a very limited version of your invoice screen. Now, the data that's inside of these columns, it's going to be based on the template. So if you got templates, for example, that contain the rate, the class, the amount, and you select it, that's going to be the amount of data that you'll be allowed to do in this batching. If you got templates that contain more columns or less columns, it's all going to be template driven. Now, one thing that's really, really important is I actually create a template specifically for batching, and there's a method to my madness there. It's because whenever I pull a report, I would like to know which invoices were created sort of by hand on demand and which ones were created in batch, because I know if I'm trying to see a potential error or something like that, it's likely that it's more likely that an batching has an error than something that I did one by one. So I created a template that I duplicated from a regular template just for this, and I called it invoice batch. And then I'll show you real quick how you run a report of invoices based on a specific template. Anyway, so then I'm going to pick the item code that is going to be for this service, or whatever the item code happens to be. So I'll just pick, whatever item code is the right item code for this. So I'll pick one of these guys here, and then I'm going to put description. I'm going to put here $75 monthly service of your home, whatever it is that we're doing. Okay. Then I'm going to put on the price each. I'll put $75. If there is a class I want to work with, of course, I'll pick a class right there. If I want a customer message that I want, go ahead and put that in there. So typically when we batch invoicing in arrears, you want to put a message saying, this is the work that we completed already. When I batch invoicing in ahead of time, when I invoice before I do the service, or I teach my clients to invoice before I do the service, I normally tell them to create a message here saying that we sent the invoice, however, where the work is being scheduled. Because when you batch invoicing, sometimes you do it ahead of time for all the contracts you have, and for other times we do it for work that we already did. And if that's an issue with your customer, just make sure your messaging is clear from that perspective. Anyway, so now I picked the date of the invoice, I picked the template, I picked the item, I picked the amount, the class, and then I'm going to click on next. So QuickBooks will give you basically a quick preview letting you know, okay, we based on the billing group, we went ahead and picked up all your customers. I picked the terms in here. I picked the send method, picked the dollar amount, and then status okay. It just says that it has no issues, that it can go ahead and create that one. So you would have an error with the status if there is a custom field or a required field that you don't have access on the screen. So that's why it says status okay, just kind of letting you know. Now, you can use custom fields that are in the line item, but you can't use custom fields that are on the header. So hopefully that will make sense. Okay, all right, so I'm going to go ahead and go to create invoices. Now, one major issue that you see here on this screen is that we got jobs and we got parent customers. So you have to really be careful that you're not by mistake also invoicing the parent, right? This is in the case that whenever there are jobs, and this is going to require for you to when you go back into creating your actual group, to just be careful to not include parents. What I mean by parents, I mean the customer and the job as well. So you may want to just be careful and make sure you go through your customer list, assuming that you have jobs, and not by mistake double bill the customer by invoicing the customer and the job at the same time. So that's kind of the concept behind just making sure that you don't invoice the client at the same time, right? Because I see some people that were kind of telling me, hey, by the way, it looks like they're having two because the parent is there, and that's basically the point. So somebody says, what if the terms are different on the batch than on the default customer? So the answer is you can't change them. You have to change them with the default customer first, and you cannot change the terms in the batch. So it's going to take the natural terms that are built in there. Okay, so really important. So I'm going to go ahead and go to create invoices, and QuickBooks is going to create all the $75 invoices in one shot. Now, depending whether the preferred send method was set up to print or to mail, these things will be automatically check marked to be batched into a print, and then you can click print and print all those in one shot, or you can click on mail and then email them all in one shot. So everything that's marked to be printed will be on a queue for print, and everything that's marked to be emailed will be on the queue for email. Okay, so that in a nutshell is that. Now, if I run a report of all my invoices, for example, so I'm going to run a report here under custom reports, transaction detail, and I just want to see all of the invoices that I did, let's say for the month. Okay, so let's say for the month, and then I'm going to go to filters, and then I'm going to go to transaction type, and then click invoice, and then hit OK. This is going to show me every single invoice that I did, batch and no batch, and that could potentially be an issue, because very often, in my opinion, very often, if you're going to do a batch, it would be nice to know which were batched and which were not. Now, you could literally, by dollar amount, you can know, I guess, yeah, that's right. Or you can literally double click on it and just see if it's using the specific template that I created just for the batching. However, something that most people don't know is that templates can be filtered as well. So when I go into customize report and I go down to filters, I'm going to go down to template, and then I'm going to select the invoice batch template. And this is the real reason why I would even consider doing a separate template just for batching. It's because I do want to run a report later on that. So let me also take all the details out, so we can actually hit OK now, and then we can see that you see all the ones that were created within batch because I used a specific template. So as of now, the only clever way, quote unquote, to differentiate invoices that were created in batch versus the ones that were not created in batch would be through a special filter of having a completely separate template. Okay, so that's invoices in batch in a nutshell. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if the invoice itself has a little check mark here, print later or email later, both or either or, only with that little check mark that you see there, they can be batch printed or batch emailed using a specific batching function. And I think most people know this pretty well, so I'm just going to fly right through it. So let me show you what that looks like. So if you want to print anything in batch that's been marked to be printed, we go to File, we go to Print Forms, and in this case, it would be invoices. And every invoice that was either manually created by one, or it was created through the batching process, and the customer has the default send method as mail, those are all going to come in here into the batch. So those you can print straight from here. Now, one of the things that a lot of people ask is, how do I get rid of all these things in batch that are marked to be printed? Well, basically just click select all, hit OK, and instead of printing it to a real printer, print it into like a PDF printer or like a Microsoft XPS printer or something like that, and that would just basically send it to a file and not literally physically print it. But once you actually go to that process of printing it or creating a PDF or an XPS or whatever it happens to be, then they go away, they get unmarked to be printed, and then when I go back into that module, and it should work now, so I'll go to File, Print Forms, Invoices. Those should all be blank, but maybe I hit cancel on the print. But then those become blank once you actually fully print them. So these are all invoices again that were marked to be printed on that top portion of the invoice, and those could be automatically marked in batch if in the customer settings the preferred method is set to mail. Those are all going to be automatically marked to be printed, right? So whether I created them in batch or not, that's a common thing. So we created invoices in batch, and very often we'll make a mistake, where, oh man, maybe I made a mistake and I didn't really put the right dollar amount, or I did the wrong item. So I want to delete them in batch, right? So QuickBooks 2016 Accountant Edition and QuickBooks Enterprise 16 introduce the batch delete transaction. So this tool here, let me switch because you have to be in single user, but this batch delete tool, I would say requires a good 20-25 minutes to go through every single feature with it. But I'll go through, kind of the most functional area of it, which is voiding or deleting all these invoices I just created in batch. But so I'm gonna go through it briefly, and maybe in another episode, or there should be some recordings out there in YouTube that go much more in detail in the batch delete. So I'm gonna go ahead and click batch delete right there from the accountant menu. Click batch delete and void, and then in this screen you're gonna get three options. You're gonna get transaction type, checks, invoices, and bills. Those are the three options that you get, right? So those are only things at the moment that you can delete through this tool. So I'm gonna go ahead and click invoices. Now, in this screen, this is the only screen in the entire QuickBooks universe that we get an additional field that we've never been able to access in any other report, which is the enter date. Typically, QuickBooks reports will give you access to entered, last modified together, and the last time you modified it overwrites the enter date. However, in this specific feature of QuickBooks, enter date, it's actually a filterable option. So if I actually select everything that was entered today, or yesterday, or last week, or last month, regardless of when it was last modified, those are all going to be showing on this area. So that's actually a really, if you are a QuickBooks nerd, if you've been using QuickBooks Desktop for a very long time, you know that in very cases, in very often, we actually want to access that enter date for whatever reason, reports, whatever. And in this tool, in batch delete, it's available as a filter. Anyway, so let's say, for example, that from here, I'm going to pick and choose, a few that I made a mistake in. So I'm going to manually select the ones that I didn't want to create, essentially. And then down here on the bottom right, you get two options. You get review and void and review and delete. So if you know you want to delete them, then we're going to click review and delete. If you prefer to void them, which in some cases I would tell you better to void to delete. I think there's argument on both sides, but I like the review and void. So I'm going to go to review and void, and then from here, something that I love in this feature is I can add a memo to every single one of the transactions I'm voiding in batch. So I'm going to put here void, and then I'm going to put created in batch by Hector, made mistake, whatever it happens to be. And then this memo will go on every single transaction that I voided. Now it gives me two options, the default backup and void, which will take you through a process of backing up QuickBooks before you void, or you can override and click void only. Okay. Now in this screen, there's also something really important here. Here at the bottom, it says transactions linked to highlighted invoice. Now, what the heck does that mean? I'll show you real quick. So let's say, for example, one of these invoices that I'm trying to void actually has a payment attached to it. So let's make sure that I select one of these. Perfect. So let's say, for example, there's a payment attached to one of them, and for whatever reason, I didn't pay attention, didn't notice. For whatever reason, there happens to be a payment attached to it. Now, what's nice about this is before you void, you get an entire column says letting you know whether or not there's a linked transaction. So that may change your decision to void it. That may make you think about it twice, or maybe figure out if for whatever reason I were not supposed to void that one, or maybe I applied that payment to the wrong one, etc., etc. Okay. And again, this is only available in the accountant edition. This is only in the accountant edition. So then I can say, oh, you know what? Maybe I don't want to avoid that one, and then I'll unmark it on this screen. So it gives you one more opportunity to check and double check, what are the linked transactions that could potentially cause a different level of accounting damage from voiding or deleting in batch. So I'm going to go ahead and skip the backup and just click void only. and then click yes, and that's going to void all 3 transactions. I immediately get a report for voided and deleted, which, by the way, I can memorize or I can print, and I can see exactly which were the transactions that were voided, and I can just double click on any of them and see the actual transaction, and then go down in the memo and see that memo that I wrote in there that's going to go across every single invoice that I voided. So very powerful tool. In my opinion, it's missing some transaction types. I wish the batch delete and void could do a lot more, but for the time being, at least in combination of batch creating and batch deleting, it's a pretty powerful one, just in case by mistake I end up creating them in batch by mistake. All right. And let's go to the next feature, which is the income tracker, which has a couple of, it actually has a couple of features with batching. So I'm going to go into the customers menu and click on income tracker. Where is my income tracker? There it is. So customers menu, income tracker. Okay, so in here, there's a couple of batching mechanisms. So I can, from here, even if I didn't mark an invoice to be printed in the invoice itself, I can also print invoices in batch from here. So for example, let's say I was going to want to print all my open invoices. Easy. Just click right there where it says open invoice, a little mustard or yellow button there. That will only show me my open invoices. I can also just show the overdue if I wanted to just print overdue, whatever it happens to be. So I can select the group, the ones that I want. Then I can click on the select all button right there in the top right. Okay, and then here where it says batch actions, I can either click on invoices, which will basically batch print them all. So I'm going to go to invoices, and that will send to the printer, and that will print all the invoices I selected in batch. Or I can also email them straight from here. So this is really good. And if in any of the customers that don't have emails, it will take you to this screen letting you know, hey, fill in their email so I can do a batch email for you. Now, why this is powerful is because a lot of times we want to, just kind of get a full view of our entire receivables, and then maybe just, print out my 5 most highest value ones and just print those and put them in a certified receipt letter or something like that. So this is just a really fast, quick way of selecting several invoices based on all of these sortable columns and email them or print them in batch. That's a really, really interesting thing. Really, really interesting thing. Okay, let's go into estimates. And this is another really interesting thing. So when you work with estimates quite a bit, especially when you want to run a report of active estimates and inactive estimates. And what do I mean by that? Many times people use QuickBooks as like a mini CRM. I want to project what deals may be coming next month, or I want to project what deals may be coming next week. Okay. So one of the ways they do it is by looking at all the active estimates. So if you look at QuickBooks right now, there's 4 estimates here. So I'm going to double click on any of these just to go to it. And there's a little checkbox here that says mark inactive or mark active. So it's really inconspicuous. It's hard to tell right off the bat. But if it says mark as active, that means the estimate is inactive. If it says mark as inactive, that means it's currently active. But that has a value somewhere. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. So I can have some that are marked active and some that are marked inactive. So I can basically go through them, mark some and mark none. And then I can show a particular report. I'm going to go to reports. Right here. Sorry, it's under jobs, time, and mileage. And you go to estimates by job. So when you go to estimates by job, you're going to get a report of all the estimates, and you're going to have a little check mark for the active ones and a check mark for the inactive ones. So you could manually go into each one, make it inactive or make it inactive. Or if you go back into the income tracker, I can actually select all of them in one shot and go to batch actions and click mark as inactive, making them all 100% inactive. And then when I go back into my estimates by job, I may have some, so the ones that were sitting there, I made them inactive in batch, and then I can go into customize report, and then go into filters, and then go into estimate active is actually one of the filters, and then say, yeah, I only want to see the active ones, or I only want to see the inactive ones. So I can actually pick and choose which ones I want to see. So if I was going to forget about an estimate that I gave a couple of months ago, or a couple of years ago, whatever it happens to be, and I don't want it to show in that report, then maybe I want to create a report that only shows me the active ones, and I can use a report to just kind of gauge the status of all my upcoming deals. But the valuable piece is back into the income tracker here. I can pick all the estimates that are still shown in here as active and inactive, and I can select them. Again, I can select them in batch and make them inactive. So it's a really important piece, right? Because whenever we troubleshoot QuickBooks files, many a times we go into client files that have 100, 200 estimates sitting there inactive, and they're old, and it will take them forever to go in one by one and mark them inactive. You can do them all from the income tracker. The next topic is going to be automation tools. Now, unfortunately, QuickBooks Desktop is not really heavily known as a software that can do large amounts of automation, right? We did the batch invoicing. That was actually pretty interesting. But that's more batching that require you to press a button. There's only two particular tools for automation in QuickBooks Desktop. One of them is going to be memorize transactions, and I'm going to go through it briefly because I think most people know about memorize transactions pretty well. So I'll go through it briefly, and then I'm going to go through scheduling reports, which is a really important new tool added in QuickBooks Desktop 2017 on automating reports. So let me start with memorize transactions, and I'm going to click on the list menu and click on memorize transaction list. So in the memorize transaction list, that will give you a list of all the active transactions that are set up for automation. The way you know is there's a little checkbox here that says auto. So anything that says auto here, that means that QuickBooks is scheduled to automatically create the transaction for you. And they basically ask you when you first open QuickBooks, would you like to accept the automatic transactions or not? I still call it automation, even though it still requires one last button, just because it doesn't require additional action. Is sort of proactive when you first open QuickBooks. Now you can disable any active transactions set up for automation by just right click on them and going into edit, and then moving them from automate transaction entry to don't remind me, or to add to my reminders list. So as long as it's not sitting there on the automate option, these are not scheduled for automation. Okay. Now, so how do you create memorized transactions on the first place? Well, that's actually a pretty simple concept. What you do is you create one sample of that transaction first. And again, this could work for the invoice example that we did, but you would have to go into each one, memorize each one, and you would have this humongous memorized transaction list, which will make things a little bit more complicated. So that's where batching could be useful. Anyway, so I'm going to create a bill for my landlord, and we'll go ahead and make that, let's say, $37.50. And I'll pick the date, the typical date, of the transaction. Reference number, pretty much put that blank because you're not going to know the invoice number until you actually get the invoice. So you can leave that blank, or you can put something like need invoice number. Right? You could do that as well. That way, letting you know that the transaction was created automatically, and until somebody physically goes into the bill and puts the actual invoice number, it hasn't been fully verified. This is just an example. You could leave it blank if you wanted to. The other thing I like to do, and this is up to you, what I like to do is in the memo section, I like to put a memo called #review. And this is a part of a much deeper strategy, which has to do with tagging transactions so you can pull them on reports. And I'll cover that briefly as well. But the reason why I do that is because sometimes I create transactions that are automated, but I still want a mechanism for someone to go in there and review them before taking them at face value. So although Rent is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think it requires a whole lot of additional kind of thought, whether or not your rent should be in your QuickBooks or not. But, for other types of bills or other types of memorized transactions that are being created automatically, I think it's good for that tag to be there just so it can show up in a report, and I'll show you how that works briefly. So once I create the bill, I actually don't have to save it. I'm not under obligation to save it. I'm just creating basically all the moving parts that I want to see on that transaction, and then I'm going to click Control M on the keyboard, M for memorize. I could also just click on the memorize button and not have to memorize well, no pun intended, remember the keyboard shortcut. So I'm going to go ahead and click on memorize, and that's going to ask me, in this case, I already had one memorized for this particular vendor. That's why the first question popped up, but I'm ignoring that for a second. And then I can call this monthly rent. Okay, and then I like to put, so if I don't put the vendor's name on the transaction, I like to put the vendor's name or the vendor's name in parentheses. Okay, so it's just a habit of mine that I'll, if I'm going to put the explanation of what it is as the name, and the vendor's name in parentheses, it just makes it easier to read when I look at the memorized report list. And then I'm going to click on automate transaction entry. And that this is the only thing that you can automate in QuickBooks. How often? You can say, well, you can pick any of these. I can say monthly. And then on the next date, let's say I wanted to start today or next month or whatever, I'll pick the next scheduled date for automatic entry. And by the way, you could also do this retroactively. So if you wanted to create, let's say the last 12 months worth of monthly insurance bills, you could take this back a whole year and it will enter them for you. So that's another really important piece. This is not only for future automation, this could also be for back data that I want to enter. Anyway, so I'm gonna pick the first of the month. Then under number remaining, if I leave it blank, it's going to be forever. It's never gonna stop until I manually stop it. If I put a limit there, if I put 12, then after the 12 invoices, after the 12 bills, none of them will be created again. That's it. So it's up to 12. So this is really good for like short-term contracts, for maybe depreciation. You can automate depreciation through here, and you can do 5 years worth, something like that, by putting number remaining 5 years if you're doing annually, or number remaining 60 if you're doing it monthly, whatever it happens to be. And then days in advance to enter basically means how many days before the transaction date would you like us to create a future dated transaction? In other words, if I date this January 1st, 2017, and today is December 1st, 2016, so that's 30 days from now, and I put 30 days in advance, basically today or tomorrow, that transaction will be entered with a future date on it. Okay, so that's a really important piece. Now, if you want to create transactions in the future, the maximum amount of days you can put there is 999, which is about 2.5 years, 2 3/4 of a year. So you can only automate QuickBooks to automatically enter transactions in the future. It doesn't matter how often it is, no more than 999 days in advance. Why is that? That's just because it's a limitation that put that in the box. So that's only if you're memorizing transactions that are going to have future dates on it. Okay, so then that's basically, again, how many days before the transaction date would you like that to appear in QuickBooks, even though it has a future date attached to it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and then I'm going to close it. I don't have to save it. So if I memorize it, I don't have to save it. However, I am going to save it to show you something real quick. So going back to the reason why I added the hashtag review on it, and there's a particular specific reason for that. It's because I would like for automated transactions to be transactions that I can pull on a report. That way I want to sort of verify them, because what happens with automation, it's just more prone for errors. So I'm going to go into the file menu and click on find, and then click on the advanced filter, and then go down to memo, and then I'm going to put there the same wording that I put on that transaction that is scheduled to be memorized or to be automatically created. So I'm just doing a memo search, and then I'm going to click on find, and that's going to show me every transaction that has that review in there. And the reason why I put the hashtag in it is because normally if I use the word review inside of an invoice, for example, like exactly how it could be, like even accounting firm could put, review last month or something. I don't want the word review that I'm using it for the purpose of looking at specific transactions. I don't want that to be searched in the description of an invoice. So I put the hashtag in there, letting me know that that's an intentional tag that I want to use exclusively for a report. So I'm going to go ahead and click on report. And then I basically have a report that I can memorize, and I can call this my hashtag review, and I can put in parentheses automatically entered transactions, whatever happens to be. And then I basically have a report for everything that was automatically entered, and then that gives me one more opportunity to review it, revise it, check that it's okay, make sure it's not a duplicate. And then once I go to it and I realize that the transaction is okay, it doesn't need to be reviewed anymore, I just basically remove the tag from the memo, hit save and close, and then go back to that report. It doesn't show up there anymore. So that's an important, as I'm kind of teaching you a little bit beyond just creating the transactions, you kind of think about the consequences of a memorized transaction. Now, the last piece here I'll show you is scheduled reports. Scheduled reports, it's here on the reports menu, scheduled reports, and then I'm going to click on scheduled report setup. And then basically, in a nutshell, and you have to be on single user, and also you have to have your email connected, because this is all done through email. So it asks me for my Gmail password because it's going to send this all through Gmail. And the way scheduled reports work in a nutshell is any reports that are sitting on your memorized report list. So the perfect example is the one we just did, the review report. So if I wanted my client's QuickBooks file to email me daily transactions that are on the review report, these are things that my client proactively tagged review, or maybe we did it through the automation feature, whatever it happens to be. Then I can click on next, and I can basically schedule this report to be emailed to me, let's say at 3 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning every single day, and we'll call this review report for accountant. And then we click on next. And then 2, I'll put the email of whoever's supposed to be getting that report. So I'll put my email there. And then I can password protect the report, something I strongly recommend, because you are sending financial information from QuickBooks automatically without any person double checking what they're doing. So you want to password protect it. You click on schedule, and then basically QuickBooks will schedule it. And then there's a piece of software that runs alongside of QuickBooks that will log into your file, pull the report, and email it automatically. So those are the two possible areas where you can do any sort of automation in QuickBooks Desktop. Somebody says, can you batch enter sales receipts? The answer is no. There's no built-in tool to batch enter sales receipts. You would need a third-party tool for that. But somebody was asking me about memorized transaction lists. So memorized transaction lists can be grouped, and grouping could be useful because maybe I want to group them into the monthlies, the quarterlies, the weeklies, or something like that. So that's in the list menu, memorize transaction list. Down here it says memorize transaction, and then it says new group. So I can create a group, and I can call these monthly. Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and go to automate transaction. Actually, let me do okay, and then where's my new group? And then what I can do is I can grab any of the ones that I want to put into monthly, and I can click and drag to the right like this. So as long as it's under it, I can click and drag to the right, or I can click and drag down, make it directly under it, click, drag to the right, and that's how you can quickly put them into the group. Now, why would it be useful for the group? The purpose of the group is that I can actually right click on the group, and I can change all the attributes of the group ones as a whole. So if I go to don't remind me and hit OK, all of my memorized transactions under that group get paused. if I actually right click on it and go to edit, and I want to put it back into automate the transaction entry monthly or whatever it happens to be and hit OK, all of those transactions inside the group get changed. So the purpose of the group is for me to pause it or resume it whenever I want as a whole. That way I don't have to go one by one. And also, you only want to put in groups the ones that get repeated on the same grouping. Okay, so yeah, these can all only be set up for automated entry, all of them, or something like that. Okay, let me see. Somebody says I need to issue 12 rent checks. Can I batch enter those? Yes, of course. You create one check and memorize it, and just set it up for batching. I would say yes. The answer to that. Okay, let's see what other questions I have here on this section is, can you, okay, Leslie, if you're still connected, I'll answer your question. There's another question. This will likely be covered again in another webinar because this isn't part of the topic. But one of the things that people ask often is, what if I have a whole bunch of things that were created as other? And that this happens a lot when people don't know, where they pick this random option here called other. And then what happens is my other names list gets a little clogged. So I'm just creating a couple here at random. So what happens is when my other name list gets a little clogged up and there's a whole bunch of other names, you can go into the list menu and click on other names. And by the way, I hate other names. Don't use them. If it's possible for you to avoid them, just avoid them, period. But if you want to convert all your other names to vendor in one shot, there's a little sort of secret button here under activities that says change other name types. And I click on that. And this will open a window, which is basically going to give me all of the things that are sitting as other name. And then I can pick which ones I want to convert to vendor, to customer, to employee, and that way you get stuff out of the other names list. Now I normally just convert them to vendor, so I just basically just hit a checkbox there. And when I have a really long list, I just click down arrow space, down arrow space, down arrow space, and mark them that way. And then when I'm done, I hit OK, and then this will convert them all into a vendor. Next episode, it's in 2 weeks. It will be top apps of QuickBooks 2016. We're going to go over, what we think the top apps are, and we're going to go a little bit detail into each one. And then we're going to take a break for the holidays and come back likely January 12th. If there's a change in date, you will get an email on that. And on January 12th, we don't have a topic yet, but we'll likely cover QuickBooks Online a year updates, or we're actually discussing possibly talking about payroll or 1099 if we can come up with the content by then. Join Michelle's LinkedIn group, which has about 160,000 members, tons of help there. And then the Facebook group, QB Power Hour, to continue the conversation, ask questions, help each other, etc., etc. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.